Theo Marlowe sat in his office, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Chicago. His tech empire sprawled beneath him, an empire he had built from nothing, but one that now felt suffocating. The steel and glass towers were his creation, but they had become his cage. His eyes flickered over the city, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in the quiet ache of loneliness that no amount of money had been able to erase. A divorce, years of neglect, and the constant distance he'd put between himself and his daughter had drained him. The world of power lunches, board meetings, and luxury cars felt hollow. Theo had been surrounded by yes-men, by people who had no idea who he really was, people who treated him like a product, not a person. People who never saw him as anything other than the tech mogul who owned one of the most successful companies in Silicon Valley. But Theo wasn't sure he cared about that anymore. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, read the text, and stared at it for a long moment. "You were right. I've lost my way." It was a message from his daughter Emma. She hadn't spoken to him in over a year. The message hit him like a physical blow. He had everything except the one thing that truly mattered, a connection to the people he loved. The sting of her absence, the weight of his mistakes, pressed down on him. He set the phone down with a sigh, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. He had been trying to avoid the inevitable truth for too long, that his wealth, his status, had isolated him from the real world. The world that wasn't about deals, numbers, and bottom lines. The world where real human connections were built on something deeper than money. And then it came to him, a thought so sudden and sharp, it almost scared him. What if he could step outside of this world, just for a while? What if he could walk among the people, not as Theo Marlowe the millionaire, but as just a man, someone who could experience life as they did? The idea was absurd, but it felt right. Theo could disappear into the crowd. He could test humanity, see what people were really like when they didn't know who he was, when there was no wealth or power to cloud their judgment. His mind raced with the possibilities. He knew it was crazy. Who would even consider such a thing? But that was the point. It would be a test, a way to see past the facades people put on when they saw someone like him. A taxi driver, hidden in plain sight, asking only one question. What is humanity really like when you take away the pretense of wealth? The decision was made. Without hesitation, he stood up from the desk, walked to the closet, and began to assemble his new identity. He picked out a simple outfit, jeans, a worn jacket, and a cap. Nothing that screamed rich, nothing that would set him apart. The mirror reflected a different version of him, one that felt strangely free. He took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown. As he left his penthouse, Theo's heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and fear. Would people treat him differently when they didn't know who he was? Would they see the man beneath the suit? Or was he just another stranger in the crowd? He didn't know yet. But this was the first step. The city buzzed with life as he walked toward the taxi he'd rented for the day. He climbed inside, the engine starting with a low hum. It was time to see the world as it really was. The first passenger would soon get in, and Theo's journey was just beginning. Theo sat in the driver's seat, gripping the worn steering wheel with sweaty palms. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the man behind him, who was shifting uncomfortably in the back seat. Theo's heart pounded in his chest. He was used to being in control, to commanding rooms full of people. But today, he was just another man behind the wheel of a taxi, nothing more than a faceless driver. The passenger, a middle-aged man with a scowl etched across his face, looked out of the window, ignoring Theo entirely. Theo couldn't help but wonder how people treated each other when they didn't know who they were. Were they different? Did they still see worth in a person beyond their job, their status? "You're taking the long way," the man muttered, his voice laced with impatience. Theo's grip tightened on the wheel. "This is the quickest route," he said, keeping his voice calm. He had no idea whether the man was right, but he had to stick to the plan. He couldn't afford to look weak, to let anyone see the uncertainty that churned within him. The man grunted in response and crossed his arms, clearly displeased. The tension in the car was palpable, and Theo couldn't shake the feeling that he was being judged, not just for his driving, but for something deeper. Was it because of the way he looked? Or was it just that people assumed drivers like him were beneath them? But then, something unexpected happened. As they hit a red light, the man's expression softened and he looked at Theo through the rearview mirror. For a moment, their eyes met, and the man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry, man," the passenger said, his voice suddenly more vulnerable. "It's just, things have been tough lately." Theo wasn't prepared for this. He had expected anger or indifference, but not this. His mind raced. Was this a sign of weakness? Or was it the kind of honesty he had never allowed himself to show? "You don't need to apologize," Theo replied, his voice softening against the hardness he had built around himself. "We all have our days." The passenger gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind that spoke volumes about the years of wear on his face. "Yeah, well, I lost my job last week. Been trying to make ends meet. It's hard, you know? I don't think people really get how hard it is until it hits them." Theo felt a pang of something unfamiliar deep in his chest. He had spent his life in a world where success was measured by how much money you made, how many connections you had. But here was this man, just trying to survive, struggling in a way Theo could never truly understand. "How are you getting by?" Theo asked, genuinely curious. The man gave a bitter laugh. "I'm not. I'm just hanging on. A little here, a little there. Gotta keep moving forward, right? No choice." Theo didn't know how to respond. How could he? His whole life had been about securing the future, about setting himself up for comfort. And now, for the first time, he was truly listening to someone who had no comfort, no security, just the raw reality of survival. The light turned green, and Theo slowly accelerated. There was a long pause, the silence thick with the weight of unspoken words. "Thanks for listening," the man muttered, his voice still heavy, but there was a quiet gratitude in it. "I don't normally talk to strangers, but sometimes you just need to unload." Theo nodded, his mind racing. He had expected a lot of things on this journey, but not this raw, unfiltered honesty. The vulnerability in his passenger's voice made Theo question everything he had believed in. Here was someone who had nothing left to lose, yet he still found the strength to share his pain. By the time they reached the destination, Theo could see the man's shoulders were slightly less tense, though his eyes still held the weight of his struggles. The man paid for the ride, tipping generously, but the gesture felt more like an attempt to regain his dignity than an act of kindness. "Take care of yourself," Theo said, locking eyes with him once more. The man didn't respond immediately, but gave him a brief nod before walking away. Theo watched him disappear into the crowd, feeling something stir inside him, a mix of guilt, empathy, and a profound sense of connection. For the first time, he wondered if this journey, this experiment, wasn't just about seeing how people treated him, but about understanding how much people were willing to reveal when they had nothing left to hide. Theo let out a slow breath, the weight of the experience settling heavily on him. He wasn't sure what he had learned yet, but he knew one thing. He was not the same man who had climbed into this taxi that morning. Theo's hands gripped the wheel tighter as he drove through the busy streets of Chicago. The city around him felt like a blur. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything in his life had been a lie, a carefully constructed facade built on the idea of wealth, power, and control. For the first time, Theo was seeing his world through someone else's eyes, and it was a perspective that unsettled him to his core. He glanced at the rearview mirror. His next passenger had just hopped into the back of the taxi. The man was tall, in his late 40s, with neatly combed hair and a business suit that screamed success. Theo had met people like him 1,000 times before, polished, self-assured, and arrogant. But there was something about this particular passenger that made Theo uneasy, as if the man's confidence was built on something dark, something Theo couldn't quite put his finger on. The man slid into the back seat and immediately began speaking, not even bothering to acknowledge Theo as a human being. "Take me to Fifth Avenue," he ordered curtly. Theo nodded, but he couldn't help noticing the man's sharp tone. It was the type of voice that commanded attention, not just from the driver, but from everyone around him. As they pulled into traffic, the man turned his gaze out the window. Theo tried to stay focused on the road, but he couldn't shake the discomfort the man radiated. It wasn't just the arrogance. It was the way he spoke about people, the way he saw the world. It was the kind of attitude Theo had encountered countless times in boardrooms, where success was measured by how much you could dominate, how little you cared for the people beneath you. People these days have no work ethic, the man muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. They want handouts. They want the world to give them everything without lifting a finger. It's disgusting. Theo's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, catching the man's gaze for a moment. The arrogance in his eyes was palpable. I guess it's easy to judge when you've always had everything handed to you, Theo said, almost without thinking. The man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. There was a silence between them, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice quieter now, but still laced with condescension. You wouldn't understand. People like you don't get it. You're just another cog in the machine. If you want to get anywhere in life, you have to step on others. That's the reality of the world we live in. Theo's heart began to race. He had heard these words before from powerful people who saw the world as a game to be won, with winners and losers. He'd always believed it too. That's how he'd gotten to where he was, by stepping on others, by making ruthless decisions that left people behind. But now, sitting here in this cab, listening to this man spout his beliefs, something inside Theo shifted. I've seen it all, you know, the man continued, completely oblivious to the tension in the air. People like you, he pointed at Theo with a dismissive hand. You'll never get anywhere if you don't play the game the right way. The game is all about power, money, and control. Nothing else matters. Theo could feel his chest tighten. The man's words echoed too closely to the way Theo had lived his entire life. He had built his empire with the belief that success meant dominating others, that his wealth justified everything. But now in this moment, with this man, he began to question everything. Maybe you're right, Theo said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if admitting a painful truth. Maybe it's all about playing the game. The man smiled, clearly satisfied with the response. But Theo didn't feel satisfied. He felt something else, something unfamiliar. It was discomfort, the discomfort of truth. The ride continued in silence, but Theo's mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. Was this what his life had become? A game to win? A series of steps on a ladder with each rung climbed by stepping over someone else? The car came to a stop, and Theo's passenger looked up, clearly relieved to be rid of the ride. He tossed a bill onto the seat without a word, already reaching for the door handle. Take care, Theo said, his voice still shaking from the conversation. The man didn't respond, only nodded curtly before stepping out of the cab. Theo watched him disappear into the busy city streets. The silence in the car was deafening. Theo sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, his mind in turmoil. He had spent so long in the world of power and control that he had never considered the damage it might cause. For the first time in his life, Theo didn't feel like a winner. He felt small. He felt like just another cog in the machine. The truth was staring him in the face, and he couldn't escape it. Theo's mind was still reeling from the conversation with his last passenger. The words echoed in his head. People like you. What did that even mean? He had always defined himself by his success, his wealth. But now, in the confines of this taxi, as he navigated the bustling streets of Chicago, he felt like a fraud. Who was he really? He was shaken, but he pushed the thoughts aside. He had a job to do, and he couldn't afford to get lost in his own internal conflict. Just focus on the ride. Just drive. As he turned a corner, Theo's next passenger got into the back seat, a man in his late 50s wearing a faded leather jacket and a worn cap. The man didn't speak immediately, just muttered a quiet thanks as he settled into the seat. Theo glanced at him through the rearview mirror, noticing his rough hands, stained with what looked like grease or oil. Where to? Theo asked, his voice steady but with a hint of curiosity. The man shifted slightly as if hesitant to speak. Just take me down to the old factory on 13th. Been a while since I've been there, the man said, his voice low and gravelly, as though he was carrying the weight of years in his tone. Theo nodded and pulled into the flow of traffic. For a while, there was just silence, the hum of the car's engine filling the void. But then the man spoke again. "You know, it's funny," he began, his voice distant. "I spent my whole life working there, over 30 years of my life. Then they just shut it down like nothing, like I was nothing." Theo's grip tightened on the wheel. He had heard stories like this before, people losing their jobs in the blink of an eye, the cruel unpredictability of the world for people who weren't born with silver spoons. But something about the way the man said it, as if it was a truth he had long since accepted, made Theo uncomfortable. "Sorry to hear that," Theo said, unsure of how to respond. The man let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, you know what they say. If you don't have the right connections, you're just a cog in the machine. And when the machine stops, you're just left behind." Theo's mind flashed back to his own past. The years of ruthlessly climbing the ladder, stepping over others to get to the top. Had he done the same thing? Had he treated people like cogs? "Do you regret it?" Theo asked quietly. The man looked up, meeting his eyes in the mirror for the first time. His gaze was sharp, but there was something in it, something that Theo couldn't quite place. It was a mix of regret, pain, and resignation. "Regret? Hell, I don't know. What's there to regret when the world's already made up its mind about you?" The man's voice faltered just for a second, but it was enough for Theo to catch it. "You do the best you can, but it's never enough. They tell you that you're disposable, that you don't matter. But we all matter, don't we?" Theo's breath caught in his throat. The question lingered in the air. Do we matter? Was that what he was really searching for in this experiment? Could he matter if he didn't hold all the power? Could the people he had ignored, the ones beneath him, ever matter the way he thought he did? The man sighed heavily, clearly lost in his own thoughts. "I'm just trying to get by now. Gotta pay the bills, find a way to live. But it's hard, you know? You start to wonder if it's worth it, if you're worth it." Theo's heart pounded. The words hit closer than he expected. He had never wondered that, not once in his life. He had always known he was worth something. But this man, this stranger who had been discarded by society, he was fighting a battle Theo couldn't even imagine. Was this the reality for most people? Just fighting to survive, to be seen? The light ahead turned red, and Theo slowed down, letting the moment hang in the silence. He wasn't sure what to say, but somehow he didn't need to say anything. The man had said enough. We all matter. They pulled up to the factory, and the man sat quietly for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. Theo looked at him through the mirror, his expression hard to read. "You ever think about going back?" Theo asked. The man shook his head slowly. "What's the point? It's over." Theo didn't respond, but the man's words stuck with him, sinking deep into his chest. The ride ended without fanfare. The man paid and stepped out of the car, but before he left, he turned back to Theo. "Take care of yourself, kid. Don't let the world grind you down. You're more than they say you are," the man said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself more than Theo. Theo watched him disappear into the shadows of the factory, the weight of the man's words pressing heavily on him. Am I more than they say I am? Theo wasn't sure anymore, but one thing was clear. He wasn't the same man he had been when he climbed into the cab this morning. Theo's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was far from calm. The ride with Marcus had shaken him in ways he hadn't expected. The man's words, his disillusionment with the system, Theo couldn't stop thinking about them. It was the same pattern he had seen in his own life, but in Marcus's case, it was raw, unfiltered truth. No pretense, no luxury to hide behind. But the unsettling feeling didn't fade, not as he picked up his next passenger, Lena. Theo watched her approach the car, her movements slow, exhausted, as if the weight of her life had followed her every step. She was a nurse, a single mother, someone who had put others' needs before her own for as long as Theo could imagine. But there was something deeper in her eyes today, a heaviness that Theo couldn't ignore. "Where to?" Theo asked, trying to sound casual, but there was an unfamiliar tension in his voice. "Downtown, the usual," she answered, her voice softer than usual, quieter. Theo knew that tone. She was hiding something she didn't want to face. It wasn't the first time she'd been in his cab, but today felt different. Theo glanced at her in the rearview mirror as they drove. She seemed lost in thought, hands clutching her bag tightly, her jaw clenched. He couldn't help but notice how she looked, like she was holding her breath, waiting for something, or maybe waiting for someone. After a few minutes of silence, Theo spoke, breaking the tension. "You've been quiet today, Lena. Everything okay?" She hesitated, then let out a slow breath, not meeting his eyes. "It's just a lot, you know? Work, life, my son's health." Her voice trailed off, but Theo could hear the strain. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. He hadn't meant to get personal, but there was something about Lena that made him want to help, to reach through the tough exterior she so carefully maintained. She gave a small, tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You can't fix everything, Theo." Her response sent a ripple of unease through him. Fixing everything. That's what he had always tried to do. Fix problems, make things right, sweep the mess under the rug. But he couldn't do that with people. And now he realized he didn't even know how to help the people who mattered. As they reached her destination, the air between them seemed thicker, more oppressive. Lena's voice broke the silence again, but this time it was laced with something different. A quiet confession. "The truth is, I've been doing things I'm not proud of." She paused, and Theo felt a chill run down his spine. "I've been taking money from the hospital administrator for putting patients in priority care. It's not much, but—" Her voice trailed off. Theo's grip tightened on the wheel, the words hanging heavy in the air. Bribes. It was a confession that shattered any illusion he had about Lena. She had always seemed like the epitome of goodness. Strong, selfless, a hardworking mother. But now there was a crack in the facade, and Theo couldn't ignore it. "Lena," he started, his voice softer now, uncertain. "Isn't that illegal?" She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Does it matter? The system's rigged anyway. You do what you can to survive." Theo's mind raced, his thoughts colliding with each other. He had spent so much time in the world of money, power, and influence where rules were broken all the time. But it was always behind closed doors, hidden in the shadows. He had justified it to himself. It was business. But now, seeing Lena's face, the guilt in her eyes, Theo realized he had never truly seen the consequences of those decisions on people like Lena. He turned onto a quieter street, the city's noise muffled as they approached her building. Lena didn't say anything more, but Theo could feel the weight of her confession pressing down on him. She was a woman trapped, and the system had made her this way, just like Marcus. "This isn't just about money, is it?" Theo asked, the question almost escaping him without thought. Lena met his gaze in the rearview mirror. "It's about survival. If I don't do this, my son doesn't get the care he needs. If I don't do this, I lose everything." Her voice broke just for a second, but it was enough to send a sharp pain through Theo's chest. He didn't answer, just parked the car and turned off the engine. Lena sat there for a moment, as if weighing her options, as if she wasn't sure whether she wanted to say more. Finally, she opened the door and stepped out, turning to look at Theo one last time. "Thank you for listening," she said softly, before disappearing into the building. Theo sat there, staring at the empty spot where Lena had stood. Her secret had been laid bare, and Theo felt the weight of it pressing down on him. What had he gotten himself into? In that moment, the questions in Theo's mind shifted. This wasn't just about testing humanity. It was about understanding it, about seeing the cracks, the flaws, the compromises people had to make just to survive. And for the first time, Theo wasn't sure if he could look away. Theo's mind was spinning as he pulled into a quiet street, the dim streetlights casting a faint glow across the empty road. The world outside felt distant, as though he were in a bubble, isolated from everything that had been going on. What had happened in the last few days seemed to be unraveling the very fabric of his reality. Lena's confession, Marcus's anger, every encounter had left him questioning his choices, his values, and most of all, the life he had built. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This was just supposed to be an experiment, a test of humanity. But what he was seeing, what he was hearing, was no longer theoretical. It was real, raw, and messy. And now, with a feeling of dread settling in the pit of his stomach, Theo was about to face another truth he wasn't prepared for. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. The name that appeared made his blood run cold. Nathaniel Collins. Theo had known Nathaniel for years. They were rivals in the tech industry, both fighting for dominance in the market, each trying to outdo the other. But the competition had always been professional. Sure, there had been moments of tension, but nothing beyond the normal push and pull of business. Or so he thought. Theo swiped to answer, his finger trembling slightly as he did. "Theo," Nathaniel's voice crackled through the speaker, cold and controlled. "We need to talk." "Talk?" Theo replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "About what?" "The deal we discussed," Nathaniel said, his tone sharp. "I've been doing some thinking, and I think it's time you knew the truth." Theo's heart skipped a beat. The truth? He knew Nathaniel's tactics. He was shrewd, ruthless, but he didn't speak like this. Nathaniel never shared anything unless he had something to gain. Something was off. "I don't have time for games, Nathaniel. Just get to the point," Theo said, his patience thinning. A long pause followed, one that seemed to stretch out forever. When Nathaniel finally spoke again, his voice was colder, more venomous. "The truth, Theo, is that your company is already mine. You've been set up, all of it, from the beginning." Theo's blood ran cold. "What the hell are you talking about?" Nathaniel let out a small, mirthless laugh. "You really didn't see it, did you? All the deals, the investments, the friendly advice I gave you, it was all part of the plan. I've been working behind the scenes for months, pulling strings, making sure your downfall would be smooth. Your company is as good as mine now. I've already secured everything I need. You're finished." Theo's head spun as he tried to process what Nathaniel was saying. This couldn't be real. How had he been so blind? Nathaniel had played him all along. The meetings, the so-called friendly advice, the investments, they were all a lie. A trap. "You think I'll just roll over and let you take everything I've worked for?" Theo said, his voice low with fury. "I'm not asking you to roll over, Theo," Nathaniel replied. "I'm telling you that it's over. You can either step aside quietly and save whatever dignity you have left, or I'll make sure everyone knows what a failure you are." Theo slammed the palm of his hand against the steering wheel, the anger flooding him like a tidal wave. He had trusted Nathaniel. They had shared so many moments over the years, exchanging advice and strategies like equals. How could he have been so naive? A flood of memories came rushing back. The meetings, the partnership that had seemed so perfect, the promises Nathaniel had made. Theo had been so focused on expanding his empire, on climbing higher, that he had missed the warning signs. He'd ignored the subtle manipulation, the way Nathaniel always seemed to be one step ahead. Now, it was clear. Nathaniel had used him, played him like a pawn in his game. "Tell me how much you're going to take," Theo bit out, his voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and rage. "I'll fight this. I won't go down without a fight." "You don't have a choice, Theo." Nathaniel's voice was cold, final. "This is bigger than you. And frankly, you never mattered much to me anyway. I just wanted to make sure I owned everything before you figured it out. And now you have." The line went dead with a click, leaving Theo staring at his phone. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. How could he have been so blind? His hands shook as he put the phone down, his entire body rigid with a mix of fury and disbelief. The anger that had been building inside him since the first conversation with Lena was now a full-blown fire. He had been betrayed by someone he had considered a friend, someone he had trusted with everything. And now, his empire, his work, his entire identity felt like it was slipping away from him, piece by piece. Theo's grip tightened on the wheel as he drove aimlessly through the streets, lost in the storm of his thoughts. His experiment, his quest to understand humanity, had turned into something else entirely. This wasn't about testing humanity anymore. This was about fighting for everything he had left. The game had changed, and Theo wasn't about to let Nathaniel take the last thing he had. His fight. Theo's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of Nathaniel's betrayal pressed down on him. The phone call had been a final blow. sharp, cold, and unforgiving. His world, the one he had spent years building, was crumbling. The foundation of trust he had with Nathaniel, the man he thought of as a colleague, had been shattered in an instant. Driving aimlessly through the streets of Chicago, Theo couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness gnawing at him. How could he have been so blind? How had he let himself be used, manipulated by someone he had trusted? It was all a game to Nathaniel, a power play, and Theo had been the pawn. As he steered the car down a familiar street, the weight of his failure was suffocating. What now? How could he fight back when his enemy had already anticipated every move? Nathaniel had control, and Theo didn't know where to turn. His whole life had been about winning, about being the one in control. But now the game had changed, and he was losing. His phone buzzed again, and he nearly jumped. The message that appeared on the screen made his stomach drop. It was from Lena. "I need to talk to you. It's about the deal. It's bigger than you think." Theo's grip tightened on the wheel, and his mind raced. What could this be about? Was she involved in this somehow? Or was it just another consequence of the system he had been trying to understand? He had to know what she meant. He had to hear her out. He dialed her number without thinking. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Theo?" Her voice was softer than usual, tinged with something darker. I wasn't sure if I should call, but I have to. You need to hear this." "What's going on, Lena?" Theo's voice was strained, his anxiety slipping into his words. "What's this about?" Lena paused for a moment, and he could hear her breathing, as though she were trying to steady herself. "It's about the bribes," she said quietly. "The hospital, the administrator, it's all tied in with Nathaniel. He's been pulling the strings from the start." Theo felt his breath catch in his throat. Nathaniel. Of course it made sense, but how far did it go? How many people had been affected? "I knew something was off," Lena continued, her voice breaking. "But I didn't know how deep it ran until today. The deal he offered me wasn't just about money. It was about control. He wanted to make sure people like you and Marcus stayed out of the way so he could take over everything. And I got caught up in it. I never thought it would go this far." Theo's mind spun with the implications. Nathaniel had been manipulating not just him, but everyone around him. How could he have been so blind? The pieces were falling into place. Lena's secret, Marcus's bitterness, the subtle hints from Nathaniel. They had all been part of a much larger game, and Theo had been a player without even knowing the rules. "I'm sorry, Theo," Lena whispered, her voice full of guilt. "I didn't want to drag you into this. I just thought maybe I could fix it, you know? But now I don't think I can fix anything anymore." Theo's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He had always believed that he could fix everything, that his wealth, his position, could buy him solutions. But now, standing at the edge of everything he had worked for, Theo realized how wrong he had been. This wasn't a problem he could throw money at. This wasn't about power or control. This was about trust, and trust had been shattered. "You didn't drag me into anything," Theo said, his voice firm despite the storm inside him. "I'm in this because of my own choices. I let myself get caught up in it all, and now I have to figure out how to get out." The silence that followed was heavy. Lena didn't respond right away. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Theo, I've made mistakes, but I'm going to help you. I don't know how yet, but I will. We can figure this out together." The sincerity in her voice struck Theo deeper than he expected. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could fix this together. Maybe it wasn't too late to right the wrongs, to rebuild what had been broken. But first, he had to confront the full extent of Nathaniel's betrayal, and that meant facing the truth head on. "I don't know how much time we have," Theo said, his voice hardening, "but we're going to make this right. I won't let him win." Lena's breath caught on the other end of the line. "Theo, be careful. Nathaniel's not the type to back down. He'll do whatever it takes." Theo's gaze turned steely as he gripped the wheel. He had lost everything he thought mattered, his company, his trust, his certainty, but he wasn't going to lose this. He wasn't going to lose Lena. "Then we'll fight. Together," he said, his words filled with conviction. As he ended the call and drove through the night, the reality of what lay ahead sank in. The battle was just beginning. and Theo Marlowe wasn't about to let Nathaniel Collins win without a fight. Theo sat in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel as his mind raced. His conversation with Lena had shifted something inside him. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. They were in it together, and that brought a sense of resolve he hadn't known he was capable of. But as the words "together" echoed in his mind, an unsettling thought gnawed at him. How much does Lena really know? It wasn't just Nathaniel he had to worry about anymore. There were too many secrets, too many hidden layers in the mess he had found himself in. The stakes had only just begun to reveal themselves, and Theo knew it was time to confront those who had been quietly operating in the background, those whose motives he had once ignored. His phone buzzed again, breaking through his spiraling thoughts. He didn't need to look at the screen to know it was Lena. He had made a promise, but something was different now. He had been thinking about it ever since their conversation, and this time, there was no avoiding it. He needed answers. Theo answered the call, his voice tight. "Lena, I'm meeting someone tonight," she said, her voice low as though she was speaking in a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can protect you from the full extent of what's going on." Theo's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" His stomach twisted with a rising sense of dread. The full extent. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when Lena finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "You've trusted the wrong people, Theo, and I've been a part of that. I never wanted you to get dragged into it, but now..." She paused, taking a deep breath. "There's more you don't know. More than just Nathaniel." Theo's grip on the phone tightened as a chill ran down his spine. This wasn't what he had expected to hear. "Who?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Who else?" Lena hesitated before speaking again, her voice trembling. "There's someone close to you, someone you've trusted for years. I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I can't keep it from you anymore. Theo, your company, your success, it was all built on lies. Lies that go beyond Nathaniel." Theo felt a knot form in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" "I'm meeting with someone tonight," she continued, her tone sharper now. "They've been keeping an eye on you, on both of us. They've been pulling strings from the start." Theo's mind spun. How had he not seen this coming? All these years he thought he was building something solid, something real. But now it felt like the ground beneath him was shaking, ready to give way. "Who is it, Lena?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Tell me who's been behind all of this." There was another long pause before Lena spoke, each word heavier than the last. "It's your ex-wife, Theo. She's been working with Nathaniel. She's the one who set everything in motion." Theo's head swam as the truth began to hit him, but even the shock of it couldn't quiet the growing rage inside him. His ex-wife, the woman he had trusted to keep his daughter safe, the woman he had shared his life with, and now she had been part of the conspiracy to bring him down. He couldn't fathom it. "I don't believe you," Theo whispered, almost to himself. I didn't want to believe it either," Lena said softly, her words like a knife twisting deeper. "But she's been using her position to manipulate the system, to control you. And Nathaniel, he's just the beginning." Theo leaned his head back against the seat, his thoughts swirling. He'd always believed that his business success was the result of his hard work and determination. But now he realized how deeply he had been manipulated. His life, his legacy, it wasn't just a result of his own actions. It had been orchestrated by those he had trusted most. "I need to meet with her," Theo said, his voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and determination. "I need to hear it from her. I need to know why." "Be careful, Theo," Lena warned, her voice trembling. "She's not who you think she is. She's been playing both sides and she's been hiding things from you." Theo didn't respond. He knew there was no turning back now. The truth had already started to unravel, and there was no way to stop it. As he ended the call, he felt the weight of the revelation settle over him. The very people he had trusted, the ones who had been closest to him, were the ones who had led him into this darkness. His mind raced with a million questions, but one stood out above the rest. Why? Theo knew he had to confront this head on. There was no more running, no more hiding. The pieces were in place, and now he needed to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. He didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let Nathaniel or anyone else control his fate any longer. Theo sat in his car, the hum of the engine the only sound in the otherwise silent night. His hands shook as he held the steering wheel, his mind torn between two conflicting thoughts. Lena had just told him everything about Nathaniel, about the treachery of those he trusted, and the deeper darkness lurking beneath the surface. But as the weight of that truth settled on his shoulders, a new dilemma began to take shape, one that threatened to consume him entirely. What did he do next? Lena had warned him. "Be careful, Theo. Your ex-wife, Nathaniel, they've been playing a game and you're just a pawn in it." The sting of her words still burned, but more than that, the crushing weight of his own choices and failures pressed against him. His phone buzzed in his pocket and he glanced at it. A message from Marcus. "Meet me, now." Theo's mind raced. Marcus, the man whose anger had been a constant companion since they first spoke. The man who had warned him about the system. The man who had lost everything in the pursuit of corporate greed. But now, Theo wondered, did Marcus have a hand in this? Was he part of the web Nathaniel had spun? Or was he just a bystander like everyone else? Theo had a choice to make. He could ignore the message, avoid the confrontation, and continue his journey alone. Or he could go, face whatever truth Marcus had to offer, and let it guide his next steps. But one thing was clear. There were no easy answers anymore. He started the car and drove toward the meeting place, his thoughts racing. The drive felt like a lifetime, each mile heavier than the last. The ultimate moral dilemma weighed on him now. Should he expose the truth and destroy everyone around him? Should he fight for what was right, even if it meant losing everything in the process? Or should he protect what little he had left, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the damage caused? Theo's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. For years, he had lived in a world where power, success, and wealth had been the ultimate goals. Every decision he made, every move he took, had been about building an empire, his empire. But now, in the face of betrayal, deception, and manipulation, he was forced to confront a truth that terrified him. Nothing he had done was clean. Nothing he had built was based on fairness. Marcus was waiting for him when he arrived, standing in the shadows of a street lamp. His face was shadowed, but there was an edge to his posture, something more desperate than Theo had seen before. "Got your message," Theo said, stepping out of the car, his voice guarded. "What's going on?" Marcus didn't waste time. "Nathaniel's playing you, Theo. All this time you thought he was just another competitor, but it's worse than that. He's been buying up your shares, controlling your company from the inside. And your ex-wife? She's been helping him all along." Theo felt a sickening twist in his gut. "I know," he said quietly. "Lena told me." Marcus's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Lena, you trust her?" "Why wouldn't I?" Theo shot back. His voice was sharp, but beneath it he could hear the doubt creeping in. Trust. What did that even mean anymore? "Because," Marcus began, his voice low, "she's been working both sides. She's been using you to get closer to Nathaniel. She's part of the plan, just like your ex-wife." Theo's head spun, the words crashing into him like a tidal wave. "You're saying Lena's been playing me?" Marcus nodded grimly. "She's been working with Nathaniel from the start. He promised her a way out, a way to take everything from you without you even realizing it. The money, the power, the leverage, all of it." Theo's mind reeled. Lena, his ally, had been just another piece in Nathaniel's game. He had been blind, foolish, believing that his connections, his ability to manipulate people, would protect him. But now, every decision, every person he had trusted seemed tainted. He had been played. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "So, what now?" Theo's voice was tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. Marcus paused, then looked him in the eye. "You have a choice. You can expose them, take them down for everything they've done, or you can walk away, keep your empire, and pretend it was all just business. But if you choose the latter, you'll never be the man you think you are. Not anymore. Theo felt his breath catch in his chest. Take them down or walk away? The question burned through him, each answer more painful than the last. Could he betray the very people who had betrayed him? Could he destroy everything to save his soul? He looked at Marcus, and for the first time he saw a man broken by his own choices, a man who had already given up everything for the truth. And in that moment, Theo knew what he had to do. Let's do it, Theo said, his voice steady now, filled with resolve. We're taking them down. Marcus gave a tight nod, and the two men stood in the shadows together, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the air. It was a choice that would change everything, but Theo knew it was the only choice left. Theo stood outside the boardroom, his heart pounding in his chest. The sleek glass doors before him were a silent barrier, separating him from everything he had worked for. Inside, a meeting was in full swing. Nathaniel, his ex-wife, and the rest of the high-powered team who had helped orchestrate his downfall. It was surreal to think about how much of his life had been shaped by these people, how deeply he had been embedded in a system that valued nothing but power and profit. Lena stood beside him, her expression grave. You sure about this? She asked quietly, her voice laced with a mix of concern and resolve. Theo turned to her, meeting her eyes for the first time with a clarity he hadn't felt in days. I have to do this. I can't keep running from the truth. I've built my whole life on lies, Lena. It ends today. The door behind them opened, and Theo could hear Nathaniel's voice, rich and condescending, echoing through the hall. They were preparing for something. Perhaps another deal, another manipulation. But today, Theo was going to stop it. You ready? Lena asked, stepping closer to him. Theo nodded, his throat tight. As ready as I'll ever be. He pushed the door open, and the room fell silent. Nathaniel's eyes met his across the room, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before it quickly melted into a smirk. Well, Theo, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you might be too busy wallowing in your defeat, Nathaniel said, his voice dripping with mockery. What's this? A final attempt to save your failing empire? Theo took a deep breath and stepped forward, the weight of the moment heavy on him. This was it, the moment he had been building toward, where all the lies would be exposed and all the truth laid bare. He had no more illusions. This was his reckoning. You're the one who's failed, Nathaniel, Theo said, his voice steady but fierce. You've been playing a game and I've been your pawn. But that ends now. I'm not going to let you tear apart everything I've worked for. The room was still, all eyes now focused on him. His ex-wife shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze avoiding his, while the others watched with curiosity. Theo could see the faintest flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by her calm demeanor. What are you talking about, Theo? Nathaniel asked, his voice suddenly cold, his smile faltering. You're out of your depth here. You have no idea what's really going on. I know more than you think, Theo said, locking eyes with Nathaniel. I know that you've been pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating everyone. And I know that you've been working with her, with my ex-wife. The revelation hung in the air, thick and heavy. His ex-wife's face turned pale, and she finally met his gaze, her lips pressed tightly together as if she had no words to offer. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their collective breath, the tension in the room palpable. I didn't want this, she finally spoke, her voice shaking. I was trying to protect you, Theo. I thought I was doing the right thing. Theo felt his blood run cold at her words. The woman he had trusted, the woman who had been by his side through so many years, was just another piece in Nathaniel's game. It was too much. He had built his life on trust, and now that trust was shattered. You didn't protect me, Theo said quietly, his voice breaking with emotion. You used me. Both of you used me. Nathaniel stood up slowly, his expression a mix of amusement and annoyance. Theo, you're not in control here. You never were. You think you can just come in and expose me, but you don't know the first thing about power. Power is something you take, something you control. Theo's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the rage building inside him. The arrogance in Nathaniel's voice was infuriating. But there was something else too, a deep, burning realization. Nathaniel had been right about one thing. Power was something you took, but he had been wrong about one thing. Theo was in control. "You're wrong," Theo said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "The real power is in the truth, and I'm done hiding from it." He stepped forward, turning to face his ex-wife, his voice soft but unwavering. "You had your reasons, I know, but you can't undo what's been done. And Nathaniel, he's not going to stop until he's taken everything from both of us." For a moment, the room was silent. Theo could see his ex-wife's hands trembling, her face etched with regret. But she didn't speak, didn't offer any apology, and Theo didn't expect one. There was no going back, no undoing the betrayal that had been laid at his feet. Theo turned back to Nathaniel, his eyes sharp. "I'm taking back what's mine, and I'm going to make sure you can't destroy everything I've worked for." Nathaniel's face twisted into a sneer, but Theo could see the fear behind it now. The game had changed, and for the first time, Nathaniel didn't have the upper hand. The moment of truth had come, and Theo had made his choice. He wasn't backing down. Not anymore. Theo stood at the edge of everything he had built, feeling the weight of the decisions he had made, the betrayals, the choices, the lies, and for the first time, he didn't feel trapped. He felt free. But freedom came with its own price. As he stared at the remnants of his old life, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place, he knew that this was his moment of reckoning. Nathaniel had underestimated him. The man had played a long game, thinking he could control Theo, thinking he could crush him under the weight of his manipulation. But Theo wasn't going to let that happen anymore. He had spent years building an empire on lies, on manipulations, and now it was all crumbling. But in the destruction, something new was forming, a version of himself he hadn't known existed, a version that wasn't defined by wealth or power, but by something far deeper. The phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from Lena. "It's time. Nathaniel's meeting with the board today. I'm ready to make it right." Theo read the message and felt the weight of it. He had already made his decision, but this was the final confirmation. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been caught in the web of lies, everyone who had been affected by the choices he had made. Lena had shown him the way forward. Now it was time to walk that path. Without hesitation, Theo dialed Lena's number, his fingers trembling slightly. She picked up on the first ring. "Theo." Her voice was tight, almost strained, but there was a determination in it that gave him the strength he needed. "Are you sure?" Theo asked, his voice low. "This is it. Once we move forward, there's no going back." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Lena replied, her tone firm. "It's time we take back control, for all of us." Theo's pulse quickened. There was a finality in her words, a sharp edge that cut through the fog of doubt in his mind. He had been questioning whether he could truly walk away from everything, his company, his wealth, his past. But now, standing at the threshold of the truth, he knew there was no choice. "I'm on my way," Theo said, hanging up the phone. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he started the engine. His destination was clear now, not the boardroom, not the remnants of his empire, but something more important: redemption. He arrived at the building where Lena had arranged the meeting, and as he walked through the entrance, he could feel the tension in the air. The battle was about to begin. His company, his legacy, was at the heart of everything, but it wasn't the most important thing anymore. This was about standing for something real. The room was filled with people, board members, executives, investors. But in that moment, they felt like nothing more than shadows to him. Nathaniel was there, standing at the head of the table, his face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and anger as he saw Theo walk into the room. Theo didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. The people who had once admired him now looked at him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. But he didn't care. He had come here for one reason, and that reason had nothing to do with wealth or power. It was about something much more profound: truth. "Nathaniel," Theo began, his voice cutting through the room, "I know what you've been doing. I know the games you've been playing. And I'm done being your pawn. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, his smirk faltering for the first time. Theo, you're making a mistake. You can't just walk away from this. You're out of your depth. I've been in the dark long enough, Theo shot back, his voice steady. But not anymore. This ends today. He turned to the others in the room, his gaze sweeping over them. I've spent years building this company, but I've learned the hardest lesson of all. Power is nothing if you can't live with the consequences of your actions. And I won't be a part of this toxic system any longer. Lena stepped forward then, her face resolute. She stood by Theo's side, her presence a testament to the commitment they had both made to each other. She looked at the board members, her voice clear and unwavering. We're taking control now, Lena said. It's time to stop letting people like Nathaniel destroy everything for their own gain. The room erupted in whispers, the executives exchanging nervous glances. But Nathaniel was silent, his face turning a shade darker with each passing moment. You think you can just walk away? He sneered. You think you can expose everything and not face the consequences? Theo stood tall, his back straight. He wasn't afraid anymore. I'm not afraid of you, Nathaniel. You're the one who's been hiding behind your lies, your manipulation, but it's over. And just like that, the moment of truth had arrived. Theo had broken free from the chains that had bound him, from the system that had defined his every move. The consequences of his choices were still unclear, but one thing was certain. He was no longer a puppet. He was in control. Theo sat in the quiet of his new office, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on him. His hands rested on the desk, his fingers tracing the edges of papers that no longer held the significance they once did. The world around him had changed. He had changed. He had done the impossible. He had confronted his past, faced the betrayals, and walked away from the empire he had spent his life building. But now, as he sat in the silence, he felt a strange sense of peace. The battle with Nathaniel was over, but the real fight had only just begun. The decisions Theo had made, the people he had hurt along the way, there was no going back. But in the aftermath of everything, he had found something he never expected: redemption. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen. It was Lena. Are you alone? Her voice came through, urgent but soft. Yeah, I'm alone, Theo replied, his voice steady, but something about the tone of her voice made his heart race. I think we should meet. I have some good news, Lena said. Her words held a note of finality, and Theo could tell that the conversation was heading towards something important. Theo didn't hesitate. He had learned that sometimes you didn't need to question the path ahead. You just needed to trust it. An hour later, Theo arrived at the small cafe Lena had suggested, a place away from the prying eyes of the business world. As he stepped inside, his eyes immediately found her. She sat in the corner, her face calm, but there was something in her eyes. Hope. Lena, he greeted her, pulling out the chair to sit across from her. You did it, Theo, Lena said, her voice filled with quiet pride. You really did it. The board is behind you now. The takeover is complete. Theo felt a lump form in his throat. For the first time in months, the weight of what he had lost and what he had gained didn't feel like a burden. It's hard to believe, he said quietly. I thought it would be harder, but I feel lighter now. Lena smiled softly. You're free, Theo, and so am I. We both are. We don't have to play the game anymore. We don't have to be anyone's pawn. Theo's eyes met hers, and for the first time he saw the truth in her words. They weren't just talking about the company. They were talking about life itself, the choices they had made, the lives they had led. It wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about finding meaning in the things that mattered. I'm sorry, Lena, Theo said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. For everything. For not seeing it before. For trusting the wrong people. Lena shook her head, her eyes softening. You don't have to apologize, Theo. We were all caught in this system, but we're not anymore. We're taking control of our own lives now. That's all that matters. Theo took a deep breath, a sense of clarity washing over him. This wasn't just about reclaiming his company. It was about reclaiming his life, his choices, his values, his future. He didn't need to chase success anymore. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had already done the hardest thing. He had faced the truth, and that had set him free. "I want to help," Theo said, his voice firm. "Not just rebuild my business, but rebuild something that matters, something that can make a difference." Lena nodded, her face reflecting the same determination. "I want that too. Together we can do it. We can build something real, something that helps people, not just lines the pockets of the powerful." Theo's heart swelled as he looked at her. This was what mattered. This was the real battle, the one that had nothing to do with money or power. It was about making things right, about taking the lessons from the past and using them to build a future that was honest, meaningful, and true. "I don't know where this road will take us," Theo said, his voice soft but filled with resolve. "But I know it's the right one." Lena smiled, and for the first time, Theo saw the future with clarity. The weight of the past no longer burdened him. It was a new beginning, a new chapter, and this time, he was writing it on his own terms. Together, they would build something that mattered. Together, they would show the world that redemption wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And as they left the cafe, Theo felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He was no longer chasing an illusion, he was living his truth. What do you think of Theo's journey and his decisions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And if you want to hear more heartwarming tales, click here on the end screen.